Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm going to wait just a couple of more minutes for people to join, and then we will kick this off. Well, welcome this evening to the first in a series of 10 speaker presentations and workshops that the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates will be sponsoring monthly for the rest of 2023 and the first several months of 2024. We have a great series of programs lined up. There'll be information about the whole set of speakers and workshops on our website soon. And I'll be reaching out to folks who have attended this and previous workshops we've sponsored to keep you up to date on the total workshop agenda and plans. We are going to proceed with a brief introduction, which I'm giving right now. Then Hannah Riseley White, Acting Director of the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission. Her real job is Deputy Director, so I guess now she's doing both of them. We'll speak first. We will take a few questions for Hannah. Then I will present a complimentary set of slides and remarks. And then we'll open up the rest of the meeting to questions and answers from the audience. Please put your questions in the chat. Let us know if you would prefer that a particular speaker respond to them. And we're going to try to leave a good 20 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. So with no further ado, I'd like Hannah to introduce herself and begin her presentation. She, by the way, is exactly what New Mexico needs in the position she is in. And I think New Mexico is very fortunate to have her in public service. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Norm, and thank you for those kind words, much appreciated. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening, and thank you to the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates for organizing tonight's event and this entire series. These conversations are incredibly important given the challenges that New Mexico is facing. I'm assuming you can see my slides, correct?
Correct.
Yes, okay, fabulous. All right, so again, my name is Hannah Riseley White. I'm the New Mexico Interstate Stream Commission Deputy Director, now Interim Director. I think as folks know, our Director Rolf Schmidt-Peterson retired at the beginning of May. And I just want to take a moment to really acknowledge the tremendous effort that Rolf brought to his work at Interstate Stream Commission. I think many of his achievements will probably go unrecognized, but he did a lot to position us in our interstate litigation, including in the Rio Grande, and particularly related to water planning and the state's 50-year water plan, along with many other initiatives. So I feel very much honored to have had the experience to work with him and hope that I can continue to carry the torch. I was invited this evening to come present to you all in terms of the agency's perspective on legislative outcomes from the 2023 legislative session. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about next steps and how we are going to proceed with our obligations coming out of that session, as well as where we need help advocating for sound water resource management initiatives at the state level. So I think, this slide you may have seen before in a previous presentation of mine or others, but I think it's very clear based on the work that we did, including with the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources as a first phase of the 50-year water plan, which I should mention is still under review at the governor's office, which ultimately I think is a really good thing. We haven't had a governor engage in this way on water planning before, and I think that's important and very positive. Hopefully that will be released soon. But the first phase of our work for that 50-year water plan was to work with the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources on what we call the Leap Ahead report, which I actually have behind me right here. But we really looked at what does current peer review science say about the potential impacts of climate change to New Mexico's water resources and landscape. And that report is sobering. And it's something that we all need to take quite seriously. We are facing significant challenges across the state related to increasing scarcity due to climate change. And that's going to have different impacts in different parts of the state, but certainly challenges across the board. And this is why it is so critical from our perspective at Interstate Stream Commission that we get together to plan ahead. There's a couple of options here. We either bury our heads in the sand and then run into terrible problems, resulting in costly and lengthy litigation and potentially equity implications across the state, or we get together right now to think ahead and look at what's needed to prepare for these challenges. I won't read through the list here, but I think you all are familiar with them. I certainly encourage you to look at that Leap Ahead report. It is on the New Mexico Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources website. If you need help finding it, I'd be happy to do that. So in terms of that is sort of setting the stage for heading into the 2023 legislative session. The most significant, from my perspective, outcome was the passage of Senate Bill 337. And this bill essentially entirely transforms and revamps New Mexico's regional water planning. And it's important to acknowledge that this concept was both recommended in the draft 50-year water plan, but also a key water policy and infrastructure task force recommendation. And the initial work to draft this legislation started with some water task force members, including Norm Gaume, and also some Middle Rio Grande water advocates members, including Bob Wesley. So a big thank you to you all and the others who participated in sort of kicking off the, hey, let's do this session. So this bill started to be drafted at the end of last year. It was sponsored by Senator Liz Stefanik and ultimately Representative Susan Herrera as well. And it was picked up as a state agency bill. And so our staff at Interstate Stream Commission worked very closely with the other initial drafters to pull together a version that everyone could get on board with and put it up during the session. A lot of folks worked to advocate for its passage, including some of you that are on this evening, and I want to thank you for your efforts during the legislative session to pull that off. It felt like a really heavy lift. Getting something through the legislature is more challenging than you might think. There's lots of committees and lots of discussions that need to happen. Our state engineer, Mike Hammond, was absolutely instrumental in getting it through the session as well. And so this bill was passed and signed into law by the governor. And it was passed unanimously, which is remarkable given the breadth of perspectives in our legislature. So I think that it kicks off a very important process over the next couple of years, and is intended to help us build resilience across the state in our communities. It's intended to do what I mentioned earlier. Let's get out in front of these changes and plan together so that we can be resilient in the face of increasing scarcity. Primarily what's going to happen next is that this bill kicks off a rulemaking and guidelines process that the Interstate Stream Commission will embark on over the next year or two. We want to take our time to get this right. The more I think about it, the more remarkable the passage of this bill is and the opportunity that's in front of us to really do something to have substantial benefit for our communities. And so we want to do it in a very, very thoughtful way. What comes out of those rules and guidelines? So the bill, as I said, directs the agency to conduct rulemaking and guidelines process. It will determine what happens over the next 2 years in that process. Will determine what water planning, regional water planning looks like for New Mexico, likely for decades to come. The previous regional water planning statute was from 1987. It had largely met its purpose, and therefore was hard for us to use to leverage funding for regional water planning. And everyone was on the same page that it needed to be revamped. We just weren't sure it would be possible this legislative session, but here we are. We feel very much committed at Interstate Stream Commission that we want to do some really robust public engagement on what that regional water planning should look like. And so we're anticipating that before we even issue a draft proposed rule related to this, we will have done extensive engagement across the state, and we're looking to all of you, hopefully, to participate in that, to bring your ideas in terms of what this should look like. We recognize that there are certain parts of the state in which there are urgent and critical water planning needs right now. And so we're going to have to figure out how to support some of those regions in parallel to the rulemaking and guidelines called for under 337. But we want to make sure that what lands out of those rules and guidelines will be well thought out and involve sufficient public engagement. And you may be asking, well, why rules and guidelines? This was certainly a discussion with the drafters. The rules will be fairly set in stone and will be conducted through state requirements for a rulemaking process. And so certain things will fall into the rules bucket. And then the guidelines will be something that our commission, Interstate Stream Commission, the 9-member appointed commission, can determine and maybe have a little flexibility around so that we can adapt as we see how things unfold as we implement, what this looks like. The other thing that's worth noting here is that the bill calls for Interstate Stream Commission to work closely with Indian Affairs Department in forming a tribal advisory council that will help shape what the tribal engagement looks like with regards to specific issues for tribal communities, water needs, water rights settlements, et cetera, and how those are accounted for in this process. And we've already initiated conversations with IAD about that process. So yes, all hands on deck. The next couple of years are going to be really critical for water planning for New Mexico into the future. I think there's a couple of things that are really worth highlighting from the bill in this conversation. And these were all points that were discussed by the drafters and then part of conversations with legislators during the legislative session. So clearly, we want to make sure that the state is ensuring the scientific integrity of these regional water plans. So making sure that they are based on the absolute best available data, science, and models. And so that will be a state role in both working to the extent we can to ensure that we're providing those or leveraging those for the regions, and then also vetting the plans that come out of the regions with regards to scientific integrity. The other big focus that is in the bill is really on implementation. So how do we make sure that these plans don't just sit on a shelf, but are really, there's follow through in terms of implementing the recommendations in the plan from each region. And so the bill calls for the regions to prioritize their recommendations, which often can be challenging, and then for the Interstate Stream Commission to report annually to the legislature on the priorities coming out of the regions with recommendations for funding for those projects. And so we're hoping that that sort of accountability loop and follow-up with the legislature will help ensure that what's recommended from the regions gets seen through to implementation. Certainly the planning, I've had a lot of questions about, well, isn't there all this planning occurring already? And yes, of course there is. Our municipalities are doing planning, tribes are doing planning, all kinds of, irrigation districts are doing planning. And so this effort is not intended to duplicate or replace that, but rather take all of that planning into account, bring all of the planning to the table, make sure the planning isn't one entity planning to take water from someplace else to meet their needs, but that in the big picture, the planning that's occurring makes sense. So certainly we're not intending to duplicate effort. Also, of course, this work is going to be grounded in state water law. So there was some concerns during the legislative session, particularly the very 11th hour on the House floor, about making sure that this didn't in some way impact existing water rights or our priority of appropriation system. And certainly that won't be the case, although to the extent that various regions want to incorporate planning around water related to active water resources management. So that ability by statute for the state to coordinate with water users on alternative management solutions. that could be integrated within this planning process. So certainly something that we're there to support and that is called out in the bill. Our hope is that this effort will result in, rather than what we've seen over the last couple of decades related to regional water planning, sort of a big effort and then nothing for a decade or 5 years. We're hoping that this can involve more consistent engagement with the regions from the state level and continued support, including building local capacity. And so certainly that's something that we're working on thinking about in the bill. And again, really involving sort of robust public engagement every step of the way. I truly think it's hard to craft viable, implementable solutions without the folks on the ground being involved in that solution making. So certainly that's where we're headed. That's just one of a number of things that came out of this legislative session that warrant sharing in this conversation this evening. So I have on this slide a couple of other things that are worth flagging, and there's more beyond this. But first, just to note, we did get additional funding for planning this session, and it's sufficient for us to stand up the rulemaking and guidelines that I mentioned. But it certainly won't be sufficient to fully implement what's intended in this bill long term. And so we're going to be looking to the next legislative session to increase funding for planning and ultimately really, if we're going to be successful, ramp up over the next several years in terms of planning staff and also funding to be used as grants to planning entities in across the state. So this isn't going to be cheap, but I think the alternative of lack of planning certainly has much more significant fiscal implications for this state and for communities. It's also worth noting we received really unprecedented funding to Interstate Stream Commission for a number of other initiatives, just a few of which are on this slide, but in particular, significant funding for the Lower Rio Grande, both in terms of capital and special appropriations. As I think you all know, we're currently waiting on a decision from the US Supreme Court Special Master on a consent decree that was crafted by all 3 states in the litigation in the Lower Rio Grande. Regardless of how that lands, we know that there's significant work for the state to be done in the Lower Rio Grande. And so really large chunks of money to do that work have come to us this session. In addition, significant funding for Middle Rio Grande work, again, both capital and special appropriations for habitat restoration, channel maintenance, and other initiatives in the Middle Valley. So lots to do there as well. And then I think we might have received what was the largest ever appropriation for our Strategic Water Reserve. As I think you all know, that's a program that Interstate Stream Commission administers, in which we can own or lease water rights for either compact or species purposes. It's a pretty powerful and yet often underutilized tool for the state of New Mexico. And so getting a significant chunk of funding, 7.5 million for that, was remarkable. Unfortunately, a lot of the special appropriations that we asked for multi-year timeframes, and we didn't get those. So we don't anticipate that we'll be able to necessarily spend the huge chunks of money for really any of those 3 initiatives in the next year, but we certainly want to make lots of progress towards getting that money on the ground, and then hope that that will position us well to request extensions on those appropriations next legislative session. I also think it's worth mentioning a couple of other things relevant specifically to Interstate Stream Commission. Peter Worth carried a bill, Senate Bill 58, related to Interstate Stream Commission membership. This is a bill that's been proposed in multiple previous legislative sessions and sort of evolved over the last decade or more. This bill this session passed the legislature and was signed by the governor. It implements much more different conditions in terms of Interstate Stream Commission membership, with the intent of having the commission be more diverse in terms of water user groups, geography, political affiliation, and ensuring that there be sort of scientific expertise from our academic institutions on the commission. In addition, the bill increases the requirements for tribal membership. The current bill requires 1 tribal member. This will require 2 of the 9 to be either from a New Mexico Pueblo or a tribe or nation. Current commissioners will serve out their terms. So So the implications of this won't be seen for a little while now, but certainly a big change in how Interstate Stream Commission membership is determined. And I think there have been some concerns, and we flagged these during the session, that even though we think the diversity that the bill calls for on the commission is important, it may also create some constraints in terms of who's viable to fill and check all the boxes in the bill. Also, Senate Bill 176 was passed and signed into law by the governor. Lots of work from New Mexico Acequia Association and Paula Garcia to get this bill through. Basically, it allows for the Acequian Community Ditch Infrastructure Fund, which Interstate Stream Commission administers, to support specifically disaster response and recovery efforts. It also removes all local cost share. Previously, there was a small cost share requirement for Acequias to receive that funding. Starting July 1, that requirement will disappear. And then less related to Interstate Stream Commission specifically, I thought it was worth noting passage of Senate Bill 329, which is for water leaders workshops. It provides funding to New Mexico Tech to put on a series of workshops for our legislators and other decision makers to help them understand better New Mexico's water issues. They hosted one in December of last year. It was super valuable and very well received by the legislators who participated. My observation is that there's a lot of support for water issues in the legislature, and a lot of hunger from those legislators to understand better how they can best assist. So I think seeing funding for those workshops come online is pretty exciting. All right, so next steps, and I'm almost done here, and I'll hand it to Norm. So what's needed looking into the interim next session? Certainly, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of implementing Senate Bill 337, which is also called the Water Security Planning Act. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. There's a lot of work for us at Interstate Stream Commission, and honestly, a lot of work for us, all of us across the state. So stay tuned. We're hoping to engage with you all on what that looks like. We're already having some discussions with legislators about what the interim legislative committee agendas might look like, and hope to have this water planning be part of that conversation over the next few months, both at Interim Water and Natural Resources Committee and at Legislative Finance Committee. And yeah, looking, as I mentioned earlier, into 2024 to leverage additional funding for planning. I mentioned the 50-year water plan. I should also just mention, I put a little note on this slide that by statute, not only is Interstate Stream Commission tasked with regional water planning, we also do state water planning. The state water plan statute requires an update or a review of the state water plan every 5 years, and that's due this year as well. Our plan at this point, given everything going on, is to write a review of the last plan, which was completed in 2018. I see some folks on this evening who helped work on that. And so that's coming as well, so stay tuned. Looking into next legislative session, I think there are a number of priorities. There was a bill this past session that was also a state agency bill that would increase the enforcement capability of the Office of the State Engineer. We see this bill as really being critical. It did not make it through last session. The state engineer is in conversation with the governor's office about getting it on her call for this coming session. Essentially, it would provide Office of the State Engineer better tools to ensure enforcement of illegal water use, which is significant and going to be increasingly important as we see increasing scarcity. Also, I think the next couple years are going to be really critical for New Mexico in terms of leveraging the large amounts of federal funding coming out of DC. And I think we're all concerned about how to make sure that New Mexico does that sufficiently and has appropriate matching funds to leverage those funds. And so I think that needs to be a part of the conversation going into next session, and is also something that the governor's office is certainly wanting to do. Water Data Act implementation I have on here. I think, you know, this will be an ongoing effort for us to work together. New Mexico Tech is the convening of the directing agencies under the Water Data Act. Those directing agencies are us, Interstate Stream Commission, Office of the State Engineer, Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, and New Mexico Environment Department. just getting a handle on what is all the data that's out there and how do we make it accessible, not only to the public, but for our own purposes. But also then what are the data gaps and how are we filling them? Another thing that I think there's quite a bit of momentum around and lots of conversation last legislative session that may come up again is how we fund water infrastructure projects in New Mexico. And if there's a way to think through better the funding mechanisms associated with those projects, I wouldn't be surprised if that is another topic that comes up looking into next session or the following session. And then last, there's a lot of interest in groundwater. As surface water supplies decline, we're going to see increasing dependence on groundwater and increasing depletions, and it's really critical that we're understanding what those resources are. Some parts of the state, we understand those resources really well, and other parts of the state, we really don't. So how do we make sure that we're prepared in terms of both the data that we need and also policy that supports local management of groundwater in a way that's resilient and sustainable looking into the future. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and looking forward to the conversation and hearing from Norm. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah. We have a couple of questions. Could you take a look at them and pick, let's say, 2 to answer right now?
Sure. Sure. All right. So there's a question on I'll just read the question out here. There's a question on Mimi Stewart Senate Bill 329, which I mentioned, which is the funding for water leader workshops. Sounds like a good idea, but my look at the legislature's website just now is that it did not even make it for vote on the Senate floor, yet alone become law. Was it funded? Okay, so you know, there may be an error in my slides. I thought that it was passed, but not with a full. Do you know, Norm? Maybe you know the answer to this better than I do. What I do know is that New Mexico Tech did receive funding, not just through that bill, but through some other mechanisms. I don't know if that was junior bill money from some legislators or a couple of different sources to put on these workshops. But Norm, do you know better than I do the answer to that question?
Well, I think they got sufficient funding for water leader workshops this year. And I'm not sure. There was a junior bill money, and there was also, I think, a direct line item appropriation in House Bill 2 in the budget.
Yeah, so it's possible that my slide is incorrect that specific bill passed, but I do know for a fact, in fact, I was visiting with Stacy Timmons from New Mexico Tech today, that they got funding for several of those workshops over the next year and a half or so. And there's a lot that could be covered in them, so they're trying to figure out what that looks like. But my apologies if that site wasn't correct, but I do know that they got funding. How do we convince legislators that funding for planning is critical? I guess I would say 2 things. One, I think it's hard for people to grasp the reality of it when they turn the tap and water still comes on, right? So I think we need to figure out how to get the public as well as our legislators to understand the risk that we're facing. So basically the information that's summarized in this Leap Ahead report that I mentioned earlier. And I think that's going to take quite a bit of education. I also think historically there's been a lot of hesitation in the legislature to fund planning because of what I mentioned earlier about it not just turning into a plan sitting on the shelf. So I think that's where if we can really tie it to the implementation piece and then show success through examples of planning, then leading to documented implementation and then beneficial outcomes from that implementation, that'll be significant. But we got to get the funding to get there on a first few rounds of planning. And certainly to the extent others here have thoughts about how to convince legislators that that's critical, we would welcome them. Feel free to reach out. So, and then should I answer one more, Norm, or how much time do I have here?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So there's a couple of questions here related to the LRG, the Lower Rio Grande litigation on the Supreme Court decree. So is the Supreme Court going to hear the case and accept the consent decree? And then some questions about the gauge, the gauging and obligations under the consent decree. So I'll answer those and then I'll hand it back to you, Norm. So we're currently, the states were litigating this issue. The proposed consent decree now before the Supreme Court Special Master is the settlement amongst the 3 states. We are currently waiting for that Special Master to issue a decision. The United States has opposed that consent decree. And so there's a couple of possible outcomes. The Special Master could just accept the consent decree and make that recommendation to the court. Or he could recommend that the decision go to the court and that there be a trial or arguments given the federal government's position on the case in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So we don't know exactly where that's going to land just yet. But as I mentioned earlier, we know that there's work needed in the Lower Rio Grande. As to the gauging question, I think it is kind of important for folks to know that what's in the consent decree doesn't change what's in the Rio Grande Compact currently in any way. So New Mexico will continue to have obligations in terms of delivering to Elephant Butte, but what's proposed is another delivery requirement downstream of that. So that adds another layer of complexity in terms of compact accounting, but also resolves one of the challenges, which is that New Mexico's delivery point under the compact is Elephant Butte, and then there's still New Mexico downstream. So I hope I answered those, and I'm happy to answer more, but I'll hand it back to you, Norm. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Hannah. And let me share my screen.
While Norm is getting his screen up, I wanted to let people know that I posted the funding for tech, where that funding came from, into the chat. I also posted a link to the leap ahead analysis in the chat, and I'll do so again for people who more recently joined, since that was early on in the presentation.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Before I get into my presentation, I do want to say that the outcome in the litigation brought by the United States and Texas against New Mexico, the Interstate Stream Commission and the state engineering staff have negotiated a settlement that is better than anything I could have dreamed was possible. And my hat's off to the folks there. And in particularly Rolf Schmidt-Peterson and Paige Pegram, I think just did an outstanding job representing New Mexico's interest.
Norm,
So
I'm going to
currently
interrupt you briefly. You're in your notes slide, so it's really hard to see your PowerPoint. I think you need to change screens to the actual presentation view.
Sorry, I hate it when that happens. Let's see.
My apologies for interrupting.
And how do I do that, Brittany?
I believe you have got multiple. Do you have multiple screens?
There you go.
If that's the case.
Okay. Back to the first slide. I'm currently president of the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates, and just very briefly, the Water Advocates were incorporated as a nonprofit in New Mexico in 1997 for the purpose of preparing the 2004 regional water plan for the Albuquerque reach of the Middle Rio Grande, which was chopped into 3 pieces for that round of planning. The plan is good, but as Hannah said, it was basically put on the shelf with no official attempts at implementation. And we're committed to seeing that this round of planning that's coming up, that's now authorized by the legislature and funded to get started. With the target's going to be rigorous planning and implementation of the prioritized projects and programs that come out of that planning effort. Our work in the Middle Rio Grande Water Advocates is guided by three major values. And as a preface to the values, we're the only nonprofit in New Mexico that is focused exclusively on water governance and water quantity management. Our values are that we have to deal with hydrologic reality, as difficult as that might be for some of our interests. We have to face our water future rather than ignore that our current uses of water exceed the average supply, and we're faced with large decreases due to warming over the next 50 years. And we must adapt to increase our resilience equitably. We must protect future water supplies for future generations. And I'm pleased to say that those values are recognized in the legislation that passed in 2023. I want to go back to a poll that is a little over a year old. But at that time, I think it was in late 1921, the Thornburg Foundation and the Water Foundation commissioned the poll by research and polling, the top polling group in New Mexico and one of the top groups in the nation in terms of reputation. They were commissioned to perform a survey of likely voters distributed between rural and urban parts of New Mexico and both major political parties. In other words, it was intended to be a diverse public poll. And the poll basically said that sustainability is an urgent priority. 75% of voters agree we need to act now to ensure that future generations have an adequate water supply. We have to improve our water data. And one of the interesting things about this poll is that when people were first called, they were asked to name several of the top problems that require attention in New Mexico, and water was not on the list. And that's because water is receiving very little coverage in the mainstream media. I think it's complicated, and most people would rather not think about it. But when they were asked to think about water, I think they ranked it as the second most important problem that the state faces. And in terms of getting the legislature to do what New Mexicans need them to do, we need to engage the public so that the public has water and New Mexico's water future on their mind. I took this photograph of Heron Reservoir in April 2023, just last month. 2023 is shaping up where it could be the year of New Mexico making progress to reform our governance of our water. As Hannah mentioned, the legislature passed several water governance bills and made appropriations that were unprecedented for the New Mexico State Engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission. A question that we ask is, was the 2023 legislature effective in implementing recommendations? There were 17 consensus recommendations of the New Mexico Water Policy and Infrastructure Task Force, which that met last year intensely and put out a report. I was fortunate enough to serve on that, and actually the water planning bill that passed was a unanimous priority of that task force. We need to decide this year what are the priorities for the 2024 and 25 legislatures. And then as Hannah mentioned, there are lots of next steps that we need to identify and tackle. We've made a lot of progress in the last year. Hannah mentioned the leap ahead analysis. The formal title is Climate Change in New Mexico over the next 50 years, Impacts on Water Resources. And it's a tremendous effort. Absolutely top drawer. My hats are off to the folks that were assembled by the New Mexico Bureau of Geology to put that report together for the Interstate Stream Commission. If there was any question about what climate change is going to do to New Mexico's water supplies, this report should put those questions, should answer them. We absolutely have critical issues that we're facing. I mentioned the State Engineers Task Force. We put out a report. It's available online, Facing New Mexico's 21st Century Water Challenges. And all 17 of those recommendations need to be implemented, and many of them will require legislation. The great work of the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission has resulted in a settlement between the three states of the litigation before the United States Supreme Court. A huge gain was that New Mexico water delivery credits that were taken from New Mexico in 2011 were restored in 2022, which gives us a little breathing room because we do have a compact compliance crisis in the Middle Rio Grande. And then, of course, we have the legislation that passed and the appropriations. So I have a little bit more detailed summary of the water legislation that passed. We've talked about the Regional Water Resilience Planning Act. That was its name before the drafters were ordered to change the name because there was already a resilience bill. It was Senate Bill 1, and Senator Worth didn't want the two to be confused. Senate Bill 1 passed, which allows voluntary regional water authorities. They're authorized, it's entirely voluntary. The neighboring water systems need to get together, and if they regionalize, they can realize economies of scale. A legacy permanent fund that doesn't affect water agency appropriations passed. This is extremely important. It's been a priority of the environmental community for years. Large appropriations were passed to protect our upland watersheds due to the efforts of the State Forestry Division and task force members. And Hannah mentioned the Interstate Stream Commission appointments bill passed. One of the items, one of the qualifications that it adds is experience in New Mexico water resources, at least 10 years of experience. And then, as Hannah mentioned, and we discussed in the chat, water education for legislatures was funded for 2023. A huge priority for the task force and the agencies is their lack of capacity. My own conclusion is that to restore the cuts that were made in Governor Susana Martinez's administration, the Interstate Stream Commission and the state engineer need about 20 additional positions per year for 3 years. The governor recommended 11 in her budget, and the legislature authorized 9. The governor requested a $6 million appropriation for water planning. $250,000 of recurring funds were appropriated for this, and presumably future fiscal years, along with $500,000 of non-recurring funding that I understand the agencies are going to use to stand up the robust regional water planning program that Senate Bill 337, the Water Planning Act, calls for. The governor requested $25 million to deal with hazardous dams, and the state engineer received a $10 million appropriation. Senator Worth proposed to recapitalize the Water Trust Fund to the tune of $250 million. The final appropriation was for $100 million. The task force recommendation for the Strategic Water Reserve was $25 million. The legislature appropriated $7.5 million, which is large, But in this record year of surplus, these under appropriations, the appropriations that didn't meet the governor's call, which is reduced from what the agencies really need, is disappointing, and it's something that needs to be brought up this interim and rectified. And finally, we get to the items that are important but failed. And all of these, except the last one, are Water Task Force recommendations. The state engineer requested authority to enforce against illegal water use, which is rife in New Mexico. It accounts for an unknown, but I believe significant amount of New Mexico's overuse. That bill was killed in Senate Judiciary, didn't really even get a fair hearing, in my opinion. The task force recommended that state matching funding be put aside in order to compete for and secure federal infrastructure funds that are out there for the asking. Non-federal matching funds are required to put this money to work, and that failed. There was an effort to reform water infrastructure capital outlay that failed. The New Mexico Environment Department did not get any new capacity. They too were cut substantially and have not yet had their capacity with the number of positions and budgets restored. The task force recommended strongly that our state water agencies cannot do the job that we really need them to do unless they can offer salaries that are competitive with the private sector. That problem is not yet sufficiently recognized, and the appropriations this year were insufficient to make any real headway. And finally, just as an illustration of the way the legislature has dealt with water funding and management in the past, it's been using for years proceeds from two infrastructure trust funds that were created at statehood. They're supposed to pay for infrastructure and projects. Instead, they are being appropriated and including this year to pay for routine water agency expenditures, including salaries and operations. So that piece is pretty disappointing to me. In the summer of last year, the water advocates presented a concept paper to the Water and Natural Resources Interim Committee of the legislature. And it had 4 components. The first is to provide for the lower Rio Grande to receive its share of water from the middle Rio Grande. The second was to create a New Mexico Water Resources Department. What that really means is to increase the water capacity and modernize our water agency's business practices and data quality and accessibility. You know, doing this would greatly increase, in my opinion, the productivity of state water agency staff. Water planning was a priority. That bill was passed. And now there's a huge job to implement the new authorities and make them work. And lastly, the water advocates recommended that this windfall revenue be set aside, $1 billion in a water resilience fund to fund the water work that we need to do over the next 10 years. We have record revenues, and we need to put them aside for what is really important and is the foundation of our life and our economic security in New Mexico, and that's our water. Today's water demands throughout New Mexico exceed the supply. Certainly exceed the sustainable or renewable supply. And my illustration here is of the Rio Grande Compact compliance track record going back to 2011. You can see the downward slope in the trend on the right. That is the accrued over delivery or under delivery of water. So every time this curve goes up, there was an annual over delivery of water. Every time it goes down, there was an annual deficit in the water that New Mexico is obligated to provide for use in the lower Rio Grande. The debt limit per the compact is 200,000 acre feet in arrears in deliveries. You can see the first line segment on the left of the graph. It goes down quite a ways. That included New Mexico credit water that was taken without New Mexico's permission and without going through the compact procedures by the federal government. Our compact delivery outcome in 2022, as of the end of 2022, New Mexico actually over-delivered an unofficial estimate of about 2,000 acre feet, when with a restored credit of 32,500 acre feet, we're a little bit, we're right at 100,000 acre feet in debt, or halfway to the margin. But nothing really has been done to change this trend. And New Mexico, you know, thank God, is having a good water supply year. But compact compliance is more difficult for the state in a water-rich year. So we anxiously await learning what the state engineer's plans are to deal with our Rio Grande compact emergency in the middle Rio Grande. Our priority looking ahead, and the priorities of the task force, I believe, the task force has been disbanded. Most of the members continue to be engaged, including working with the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission as water ambassadors. I'm one of the water ambassadors, and the water advocates' priorities and the task force recommendations align. We need to implement rigorous, robust water planning pursuant to the new authorities that were passed in Senate Bill 337. I understand informally that the Interstate Stream Commission is estimating it will take 2 years to stand up this program. In the meantime, the water advocates want to see the Middle Rio Grande water interests self-organize and do the work that we need to do, so that when the Interstate Stream Commission rules and guidelines become final, that the Middle Rio Grande is ready at that date to submit its first proposal for implementation funding. The state engineer enforcement authority, as I've mentioned before, is absolutely crucial. The water advocates thought that should be on the governor's call, and independently, I've learned just in the last couple of days that the state engineer wants to see it on the governor's call and is making that request. We need to transition to sustainable groundwater use. And part of the way that gets started is to very substantially increase New Mexico's measurement and monitoring of the groundwater basins throughout the state. The water advocates, in conversation with Stacy Timmons of the New Mexico Bureau of Geology, have settled on a number of 200 dedicated monitoring wells distributed in the aquifers across the state. I hope that this year that we can put more detail to that and be successful in the 2024 legislature to obtain funding to implement those monitoring wells. And I would add, installation of monitoring wells in Albuquerque back in the 1990s were the key to convincing everybody that business as usual in Albuquerque with a groundwater only supply could not continue. And last, I think we need to see reorganization of the state engineer and the Interstate Stream Commission. The state engineer is working on that and implementing it on his own authorities. But tremendous support of the agencies is needed so that the agencies can modernize their paper-based business processes go entirely to digital business processes, and in doing that, modernize the way that data is collected and made available for everyone else to use. A lot of the data that comes into the state engineer on paper, frankly, is poor quality, and the efforts that were authorized in 2019 with the State Water Data Act are crucial to see those through, and that includes major upgrades in the hardware and software capabilities of the agencies. And with that, let's open things up for questions. For those of you, or for everybody, when you exit this meeting tonight, a survey will pop up on your screen, and we really ask you to fill that out. We're seeking information from you that we will use in our planning and in our advocacy as this year plays out. So let's go to questions, please. Brittany? Let's see.
Did you want me to read the questions? I'm sorry.
No, I've got them up now. So one question, does this address where and when the inevitable need for all residential and commercial sites to reduce water use? Well, we all know that that's going to be essential, those of us who pay attention to water. The formal conclusions need to be drawn through the regional water planning process, because in the regional water plans that will be developed under the authorities that became law this year, it's going to be essential that the regions balance their water budget. And they do that in a way that water supplies are preserved for the use of future generations. That's in the law. There will be a variety of ways to reduce demand, but it is going to require great conservation across the board. So I think maybe the bottom line there is you've not seen anything yet. A question for Hannah. We owe Texas about 93,000 acre-feet of water, and we have a tremendous amount of water going down the stream to Texas. Who has the authority to determine how much water is paid to Texas? And before Hannah answers, let me first explain that the compact allocates a minimum of 57% of the inflow to the Middle Rio Grande. That is the flow of the river at the Otoe Gauge on the bridge to Los Alamos. New Mexico owes a minimum of 50% of that water for delivery to Texas. And even though we're seeing huge amounts of water going by, the compact allocation to users below Elephant Butte Dam, I shouldn't have said Texas, it's all the users, including the Mexicans, who get 57% of the water we delivered, coincidentally. We owe that to them. So Hannah, I guess I answered the question. Would you please weigh in too?
Yeah, I would just add, thank you, Norm, and thanks for the question. In terms of who has the authority to determine how much water is actually paid to Texas, there are specific accounting protocols in place amongst the states. Each state has an engineer advisor, and then that accounting, follows like a very specific methodology. What's proposed in the Lower Rio Grande is adding to what already exists, another set of accounting for the Lower Rio Grande piece. And then those engineer advisors, present that accounting to the Rio Grande Compact Commission. And one of the things that was significant at this year's Compact Commission meeting is that because of the conflict amongst the states, we had different accounting for the last 10 years or so, but we're now on the same page amongst the states. And the engineer advisors work really hard to update the accounting for the previous number of years so that our accounting is consistent. But that is all laid out specifically by the compact. Thanks.
Thanks, Hannah. Let's see. What does planning mean? What do you envision the outcome of good planning looking like in 50 years? Well, my envisioned future is that all the regions in New Mexico would prepare a robust regional and set of community water plans in the next 10 years. And a program of continuous planning would be implemented because plans have to adapt to changing circumstances and what happens in implementation. So it needs to be a continuous effort. And so what I hope we have in 50 years from now is that planning is water planning and water resilience and water conservation is a part of New Mexico's deeply held values. And we have succeeded in protecting our water and economic security by making sure that water is available for the future for the uses that frankly need to be hammered out in the regional water planning program. I suspect that Hannah might have thoughts as well.
Yeah, thanks, Norm. I think it's a good question. What is planning? Because I find that when you talk about plans or planning with different people, you often find that everyone has something slightly different in mind. But I would just say, yeah, I think 50 years out, we want New Mexico to have economically and culturally viable communities that we're continuing to thrive. And I think someone, it might have even been Phil King, who I think is on here, another water task force member, said something like, where you are 50 years from now depends in some ways on your starting point. So actions that we take in the next few years may affect our starting point in terms of where we end up 50 years out. So I also think it's worth sharing, when we started working on the 50-year plan, a lot of people said 50 years, that's a long time. And then we held a tribal forum with a bunch of tribal representatives from across the state. And they said 50 years, that's just one generation. Is that all you're planning for? So it was an interesting sort of divergence in interpretations about that term frame, but certainly I think, planning will result in our communities being thriving into the future. And that's what we're intending to do here. Thanks, Norm.
And the last question that we're going to answer this evening is someone is wondering how Hannah envisions capacity building playing out through Senate Bill 337. And I'm going to take a stab at that answer. It is the subject of future workshops in this series that we're going to be presenting this year. The next discussion on July 15th will be about implementation of Senate Bill 337 and putting that, what needs to be done in the rules and guidelines to flesh out the bill, which really only contains the authorities and some basic absolute must-dos like scientific integrity and like forming representative regional water planning entities. So we'll talk about that on July 15th, and then planning staff from the Interstate Stream Commission will present at the July workshop to talk about their plans to stand up this robust regional water resilience planning program. And with that, we're going to conclude this evening. This meeting has been recorded. It will be posted on our website soon. And please, as you leave, take some time to fill out our survey. Thank you for attending tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our future workshops this year.
And for those of you who weren't monitoring the chat, Norm mentioned July 15th. It's actually, the next session will be June 15th.
Oops. I think the next
Thank you.
dates are June 15th and July 20th. They'll be the third Thursday of each month at 6:30 p.m. Goodbye, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thanks much, everybody. And thank you, Norm and the advocates.
Thank you for speaking. We appreciate you being here tonight.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Norm.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was great.